If telling the truth calmly has ever turned a normal conversation into a meltdown, this video is for you. Because when some women hear the truth, they don't hear information, they hear a threat. Let's talk about why that happens. The moment the truth changes everything. Let's start with something simple. You say something honest, calm, direct, no insult, no attitude, and suddenly the room changes. Her face tightens, her tone shifts. The conversation isn't a conversation anymore. Now it's a problem. Most men think this happens because the truth was harsh. It wasn't. What really happened is this. The truth didn't hurt her feelings, it threatened her internal story. And that's a completely different thing. Here's where men get it wrong. They assume honesty is about facts. They assume if they explain clearly, gently, logically, it'll land. But with some women, honesty isn't processed as information. It's processed as identity feedback. You weren't just sharing your thoughts. You were challenging who she believes she is. And when that happens, the reaction isn't disagreement. It's defense. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how the reaction is rarely proportional? You say, I don't think this is a good idea. She hears, you don't believe in me. You say, I'm not happy with how this is going. She hears, you're not enough. You say, I need space. She hears, I'm about to be abandoned. That's not misunderstanding. That's translation through insecurity. Here's a small story. A man tells his partner he's overwhelmed. He explains he's stressed, tired, stretched thin. He doesn't blame her. He doesn't accuse. He just tells the truth. Her response, you're saying I'm the problem. No, he didn't say that. But the truth collided with an identity that says, I'm supportive, I'm good, I don't create stress. So instead of hearing his reality, she protects her self-image by attacking his honesty. This is why the reaction feels irrational, because it's not about what you said, it's about what your truth forces her to confront. Some women don't just have emotions, they build safety around them. They create a version of reality where their intentions equal outcomes, their feelings equal facts. Their self-image must stay intact at all costs. And when you tell the truth, you poke a hole in that structure. That's why the reaction feels extreme. It's not drama, it's structural collapse. Now let's be clear, this is not about all women. This is about a specific pattern. A pattern where emotional comfort matters more than reality, where reassurance matters more than growth, where honesty feels like betrayal. And here's the part no one tells men. When you tell the truth calmly, without guilt, without anger, you remove her ability to control the narrative. And that's terrifying for someone who relies on emotional framing to feel safe. So what does she do? She escalates. She raises her voice. She cries. She accuses. She reframes you as cruel, insensitive, cold, or changed. Not because you're wrong, but because if you're right, something has to change. And change is uncomfortable, especially when it means responsibility. This is why men walk away from these moments confused. They think, I didn't say anything bad. You didn't. You said something real. And real threatens illusion. Truth removes padding. Truth removes excuses. Truth removes emotional leverage. And when that leverage disappears, some women don't negotiate. They react. That's the moment this video is about. Not yelling, not chaos, but that instant where honesty crosses an invisible line. The line between conversation and emotional survival. In the next section, we're going to break down why identity matters more than truth for some women, and why your honesty feels like an attack even when it isn't. Because once you understand that, you'll stop blaming yourself for reactions you didn't cause. When truth threatens identity. Here's the part most men never realize. For some women, identity is not flexible, it's fragile. And when identity is fragile, truth becomes dangerous. You think you're commenting on a situation. She feels like you're commenting on her, not her behavior, not her decision, not her choice, her worth. This is why logic doesn't work in these moments, because logic assumes separation. Separation between who someone is and what someone does. But when identity and behavior are fused together, there is no separation. Critique the action. It feels like rejection of the person. And once that happens, the emotional brain takes over. Let's slow this down. Many women are raised with a subtle but powerful message. If you feel something strongly, it must be valid. Over time, that message evolves into something more dangerous. If I feel hurt, someone must be wrong. So when you tell the truth and it creates discomfort, the discomfort has to be blamed. And guess who becomes the target? You. Here's an example. A woman starts a project. She's excited. She's invested emotionally. You look at it honestly and say, I don't think this is going to work long term. You're talking about the project. She's not hearing that. She's hearing, you don't believe in me. You think I'm incompetent. You see me as a failure. That's not because you said those things. It's because her identity is attached to the outcome. So your honesty doesn't land as feedback, it lands as threat. and the mind does what it always does when threatened. It defends, not calmly, not rationally, emotionally. This is where the reaction begins to escalate. She's not trying to understand your point, she's trying to protect herself. That protection can look like anger, tears, accusations, victim language, not because she's evil, but because she feels exposed. Truth exposes gaps between how someone sees themselves and what reality is showing, and exposure is uncomfortable, especially for someone who's been taught that self-esteem must be protected at all costs. Here's something important. Men are usually taught the opposite. Men are taught criticism means improve, feedback means adjust, reality is something to face, not negotiated. So when a man hears the truth, it hurts, but it gives direction. When a woman with fragile identity hears the truth, it hurts, and it creates panic. Because if the truth is right, then the self-image is wrong, and changing self-image feels like losing control. That's why the response often isn't, "Tell me more." It's, "Why are you being like this?" Notice the shift. The focus moves away from the truth and onto you. Your tone, your timing, your intention, your personality. Anything except the content of what you said. This is not accidental. It's a defense maneuver. If she can make you the problem, she doesn't have to face the message. This is also why reassurance becomes addictive, because reassurance temporarily restores the identity. It patches the crack, but it doesn't fix the structure. So the cycle continues. She asks for honesty. You give it. She reacts. You soften. You backtrack. You reassure. And her identity survives another day, until the next truth. This is why some women don't actually want honesty. They want emotional safety disguised as truth. They want reassurance that doesn't challenge anything. They want validation without responsibility. And when you refuse to play that role, when you stay grounded, the reaction feels intense, because you're not just disagreeing. You're forcing her to choose between comfort and reality. And for someone who has built their emotional stability on comfort, that choice feels like a threat. In the next section, we're going to break down the predictable reaction pattern that follows this moment. The same pattern men experience over and over, regardless of the situation. Once you see it, you won't be surprised by it again. The backlash pattern you can set your watch by. By the time most men come to terms with what's happening, the damage is already done. Because the reaction that follows honesty isn't random, it's patterned, predictable, almost mechanical. Once you see the sequence, you'll recognize it immediately, not just in one relationship, but across many. Here's how it usually unfolds. First comes shock. Not loud shock, quiet disbelief. A pause, a stare, a subtle shift in tone. This is the moment your words land, not as information but as a threat. Next comes reinterpretation. What you said gets translated. "I'm not comfortable with this" becomes "you don't care about me." "I don't agree" becomes "you're against me." "I need time" becomes "you're pulling away." This reinterpretation is crucial, because now the issue isn't the truth anymore, it's the emotional meaning attached to it. Then comes emotional escalation. This is where things feel confusing. The volume rises, the emotion intensifies, logic disappears. You're suddenly dealing with tears, anger, or accusation that doesn't match the original statement, and you're left thinking, how did we get here? Here's the answer. Escalation shifts power. Once emotion floods the situation, the conversation is no longer about facts, it's about feelings. And feelings demand immediate response, comfort, reassurance, apology. Whether or not you did anything wrong, if you don't respond the right way, the escalation continues, which leads to the next phase, moral reversal. This is where you become the problem. You're cold, you're insensitive, you lack empathy, you've changed. The truth you spoke is now framed as cruelty. Your calm becomes evidence against you, and suddenly you're defending yourself instead of discussing the original issue. That's not an accident, it's how the dynamic resets. Once you're on defense, the truth is off the table. Finally comes punishment, silence, withdrawal, passive aggression, emotional distance. This teaches a lesson, not consciously, maybe, but effectively. Truth leads to pain, so what does the brain do? It adapts. You start choosing your words more carefully. You hesitate before being honest. You soften edges. You omit details, not because you're dishonest, but because you're conditioned. Over time, honesty becomes associated with conflict, and silence becomes associated with peace. That's how men learn to shut down. Here's an example. A man tells his partner he doesn't like how money is being handled. He's calm, he's specific, he's honest. The reaction? She cries. She accuses him of not trusting her. She says he's controlling. Now he's not talking about money, he's defending his character. Next time he notices the same issue, he says nothing, not because he agrees, but because he remembers the cost. This is how emotional training works. The pattern repeats until the man internalizes one rule. Truth creates chaos, and chaos is exhausting, so he avoids it. This is where men start hearing things like, "You never communicate, you never open up, you're emotionally unavailable." But that's not the full story. He learned that opening up leads to punishment. He learned that honesty isn't rewarded, it's used. So he adapts. This isn't cowardice, it's self-preservation. And here's the most important part. The woman often doesn't realize she's doing this. From her perspective, she's just reacting. She feels hurt, so she expresses it. But feelings don't exist in a vacuum. They shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. When emotional reactions consistently shut down honesty, honesty disappears. That's not a mystery, that's conditioning. In the next section, we're going to look at what happens to men over time when this pattern repeats, how it changes their behavior, their attraction, and their willingness to engage at all, because this is where relationships quietly start to die, how men slowly disappear without leaving. This is the part no one talks about, not the arguments, not the blow-ups, but the quiet shift that happens after. Men don't shut down all at once, they fade. At first he still tries. He explains himself differently. He chooses softer words. He adds disclaimers. "I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying, maybe it's just me, but I don't want you to take this the wrong way." Notice what's happening. He's managing emotions before he's even expressed a thought. That's not communication, that's preemptive damage control. Over time, even that becomes exhausting. So he starts editing, he shares less, he shortens answers, he avoids topics that lead to tension, he learns which truths cause reactions and quietly locks them away. This is how silence replaces honesty. Not because he has nothing to say, but because he's learned that saying it costs too much. Here's something important. Most men don't stop caring, they stop engaging. They still notice the problems, they still feel frustration, they still have opinions, they just keep them to themselves, because every time they tried to be real, it turned into a fight they didn't start. So they adapt, they become agreeable, they nod, they say it's fine when it isn't. From the outside it looks like compliance, from the inside it's withdrawal. And this is where attraction starts to die. Not because the man became weak, but because he stopped being present. Presence requires honesty. Honesty requires safety. When safety disappears, presence follows. This is also where resentment begins. Quiet resentment, the dangerous kind, not explosive anger, but emotional distance. He stops initiating conversations. He stops offering opinions. He stops investing emotionally. He's there, but he's not there. And the woman often doesn't notice this shift at first. She thinks things are calmer now, less conflict, less tension. What she doesn't realize is that the relationship didn't improve, it numbed, and numb relationships don't last. Eventually, she starts asking questions. Why don't you talk anymore? Why are you so distant? Why don't you open up like you used to? And this is where the irony hits. She wants emotional intimacy after punishing it. She wants honesty after reacting to it. She wants closeness after making it unsafe. From the man's perspective, this feels impossible. He remembers what happened the last time he was honest. He remembers the reaction, the escalation, the reversal. So when she asks for more, he doesn't know how to respond, because the cost hasn't changed, only the demand. This is how men learn a brutal lesson. Silence keeps the peace. Truth creates chaos, and peace feels better than chaos, at least in the short term. But here's the long-term cost. A man who can't speak honestly loses connection to himself. He stops trusting his own reactions. He questions his own perceptions. He second-guesses his instincts. And once that happens, leadership disappears. Not dominance, clarity, groundedness. The things that made him attractive in the first place. This is why some women say, he's not the same man anymore. They're right, but they helped create that version. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but predictably, because repeated punishment trains behavior. In the next section, we're going to expose the real reason these reactions happen. Not insecurity, not emotion, but something deeper and harder to admit. And once you see it, the whole dynamic snaps into focus. The real reason the truth triggers her. This is where most explanations stop too early. People say, she's insecure, or she's emotional, or she just needs reassurance. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. The deeper reason the truth triggers such strong reactions is this. Truth removes emotional control. When you're honest, calmly, clearly, without apology, you take something away. Not love, not care, leverage. As long as emotions can reshape reality, there's power in them. But truth doesn't bend. Truth doesn't negotiate. Truth doesn't soothe just because someone is upset. And for someone who has learned to regulate their world through emotional response, that's destabilizing. Here's what this looks like in real life. A woman feels uncertain. Instead of sitting with that discomfort, she looks outward. She looks for reassurance, validation, agreement. When you provide that, even if it's false, the discomfort goes away, so the pattern is reinforced: emotion, reassurance, relief. But when you tell the truth instead, the discomfort stays, and now it's your fault, because if you had just been supportive, she wouldn't feel this way. This is why reactions intensify when you don't budge, when you stay calm, when you don't argue, when you don't rush to fix her feelings. Your groundedness exposes something uncomfortable, that her emotions don't control reality, and that realization feels like losing balance. So the response escalates. Crying becomes pressure, anger becomes accusation, withdrawal becomes punishment, not always consciously, but functionally. The goal is the same: restore emotional influence, get you to move, get you to soften, get you to bend. Once you do, everything calms down, which teaches a powerful lesson. Emotional intensity works. This is also why some women seem to go crazy only with men they care about, because those men matter. Their agreement matters, their validation matters. Strangers don't trigger this reaction, only men whose approval carries weight. That's why the backlash feels personal, because it is. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A relationship built on emotional control is not intimacy, it's negotiation under pressure. And the moment you stop negotiating, the system breaks. This is why telling the truth feels like flipping a switch. Suddenly, everything changes. The tone, the mood, the dynamic. Because the rules are no longer being followed. You're not reacting the way you're supposed to. You're not fixing. You're not reassuring. You're not absorbing the discomfort. You're letting it exist. And that forces her to deal with it herself, which is exactly what she's been avoiding. This is also why respect is tied to this moment. Deep down, many women don't respect men who collapse under emotional pressure. They may get comfort, but they lose attraction, because strength isn't about dominance, it's about stability. And a man who stays grounded in truth, even when emotions rise, communicates something powerful. I won't abandon reality to manage your feelings. That's threatening, but it's also clarifying. In the final section, we're going to talk about what men should do with this knowledge, not how to win arguments, but how to protect their integrity and choose healthier dynamics. Because once you see this clearly, you can't unsee it. What this means for men, and what to do next. Once you see this pattern clearly, you can't pretend you don't, and that's where things change. Because this isn't about winning conversations, it's not about being harsh or cold, and it's definitely not about provoking reactions. It's about understanding your role. Here's the truth most men were never taught. You are not responsible for managing another adult's emotional stability. You are responsible for being honest, responsible for managing another adult's emotional stability. You are responsible for being honest, being clear, being grounded. That's it. What someone does with the truth is their responsibility, not yours. When you accept that, a lot of confusion disappears. You stop asking, how do I say this without upsetting her? And you start asking, how do I say this without betraying myself? That shift matters, because once you start bending truth to protect emotions, you lose something important: self-respect, and relationships don't survive long without it. Here's what grounded honesty actually looks like. It's not aggressive. It's not emotional. It doesn't argue. It sounds like, this is how I see it. This is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I'm not okay with. No speeches, no justifications, no apologies for existing. And when the reaction comes, because sometimes it will, you don't escalate, you don't explain more, you don't chase understanding, you don't retreat into silence either. You hold your position calmly. This is where compatibility reveals itself. A woman who can sit with discomfort, reflect and respond, that's emotional maturity. A woman who escalates, punishes or rewrites reality, that's not. And here's the part men struggle with. Some relationships don't survive honesty, not because honesty is wrong, but because the relationship was built on emotional cushioning, on avoidance, on reassurance loops, on unspoken rules. Truth removes those supports, and when they collapse, what's left is reality. Sometimes that reality is growth, sometimes it's distance, but either way it's real. This is also why telling the truth feels risky, because it is, but the alternative is worse. Living in constant self-editing, walking on emotional landmines, slowly disappearing to keep the peace. That's not love, that's performance, and performance always ends in burnout. Here's something important to understand. When a woman reacts strongly to truth, she's showing you something valuable. She's showing you how she handles discomfort, accountability, reality. Pay attention to that, because that's not a one-time thing, that's a pattern. And patterns don't disappear just because you avoid them, they only get louder. So if there's one takeaway from this video, it's this: truth doesn't destroy good relationships, it exposes bad foundations. If honesty causes chaos, the issue isn't the honesty, it's what the relationship was built on. And once you understand that, you stop fearing reactions, you stop shrinking, you stop apologizing for clarity. You become steady, and steadiness is what separates men who lose themselves from men who keep their integrity intact. If this resonated with you, you already know why. You've lived it. You felt that moment when the truth changed the atmosphere. Drop a comment if you've experienced it, not to vent, but to recognize the pattern. Because once men start seeing this clearly, they stop blaming themselves for reactions they didn't create. And that's where real freedom begins. Conclusion. Here's the quiet truth most men eventually discover the hard way. Honesty doesn't end relationships. It tests what they were built on. If telling the truth calmly creates chaos, the issue was never your tone, it was never your timing, and it was never your intention. The issue was that the relationship required emotional cushioning to survive. Reassurance instead of reality. Agreement instead of alignment. Silence instead of clarity. And the moment you stopped playing that role, everything shook. That's not because you did something wrong. It's because truth removes illusion, and illusion is what some people rely on to feel safe. This is why so many men feel confused after these moments. They replay the conversation in their head. They search for the mistake. They wonder what they could have said differently. But the real mistake was believing honesty would be received as information instead of identity feedback. Once you understand that, a lot of self-blame disappears. You stop seeing yourself as bad at communication. You stop thinking you're cold or insensitive. You stop apologizing for clarity. You realize something important. A healthy relationship doesn't punish honesty. It uses it. It doesn't require you to shrink. It doesn't require you to manage emotions that aren't yours. And it doesn't turn calm truth into a character flaw. Yes, truth can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is where growth happens. If someone can't tolerate reality without escalation, blame, or punishment, that's not love. That's dependency. And dependency always demands silence in exchange for peace. Here's what matters most. When you choose honesty, real honesty, you're not trying to provoke a reaction. You're protecting your integrity. You're choosing to stay connected to your own perception instead of outsourcing it. And that choice filters everything. It filters who can meet you at that level. It filters who can grow with you. And it filters who was only comfortable as long as you played a role. Some people will walk away when the truth shows up. Let them, because the alternative is staying in a relationship where you slowly disappear just to keep things calm. And that's not connection. That's erosion. If this video resonated with you, you already know why. You've lived that moment where the truth changed the atmosphere, where calm honesty turned into conflict, where you realized silence felt safer than being real. You're not alone in that experience, and you're not broken for noticing it. If you're willing, drop a comment and share the moment when telling the truth backfired for you. Not to complain, not to attack, but to recognize the pattern. Because when men start seeing this clearly, they stop blaming themselves for reactions they didn't cause. And that's where real self-respect begins.